So you can just indicate to me when we should start.
Yeah, yeah, sure. Just waiting because participant it's only 9:04. Participants usually took 3 to 4 minutes to join. So
Yeah.
Ronnie, may I suggest something?
yes, yes, sure.
Since we are waiting, could we request Professor Pattanaik to say a few words about this whole lecture series?
Oh, yes, sure.
Well, actually, we started with the idea of having the entire series on welfare economics. Now, as you know, welfare economics has two distinct streams. One is it is concerned with aggregation of preferences, or basically voting theory, arrow. And that is about social decision making, where the problem is different people have different types of orderings of the social states, and the society, given those orderings, which typically take the form of voting, how does it aggregate them, so as to arrive at a social decision. The second stream, which is due to the first person to point out the arrow problem with the arrows framework, was Ian Little in a review in 1951. He said that, look, we are not concerned with this thing. This is pure politics. We are concerned with social welfare judgment. Somebody is giving his evaluation of social welfare, which is very different from taking a social decision through voting. So there are two distinct streams. One is the standard voting theory, of which a generalized version is Arrow's Impossibility Theorem, social decision making. The other thing is Little, Bergson, Sen, another stream, social welfare judgments of some single person who is evaluating the welfare of the society. So both the parts we thought of first to choose one of them. My interpretation of the capability approach is it is following the Bergson summation stream and has very little to do with Arrow's impossibility theorem. Whereas quite a few people have linked up the two things. So we thought finally that we shall cover both the parts, the aggregation of votes or aggregation of individual orderings of social states, and the second is a single individual's welfare judgments. So this is today's topic, of course, is about arrow aggregation of votes or decision making. And then later on, our one of our speakers, Maurice Sall, he will talk about impossibility theorem, which is again about the aggregation of orderings. So we are covering both the parts.
Yes.
But that
Thank you,
distinction.
Professor Pattanaik. That was an excellent introductory remark, and I myself personally benefited a great deal. Thank you. I can now place today's lecture, particularly Rajat's lecture, in the whole scheme. Thank you. I appreciate that.
Welcome. You're welcome.
Thank you, sir. So, so it is 9:08. So, as for our usual practice, I say some few words on this session, to invite Professor Rajat Deb, and then I would read a brief introduction on him, so that we could the participants who are new and do not aware of such information. And so I would like to begin. Professor Pattanaik, may I begin?
I do.
Yeah. Thank you, sir. So today is the seventh session, and the whole study circle's title is Individual Well-being and Social Welfare. So today's topic is Arrow's Impossibility Theorem, and today's speaker is Professor Rajat Deb from Southern Methodist University. Respected scholars, colleagues, distinguished participants, and dear friends, good evening, and a very warm welcome to Session 7 of International Study Circle on Individual Well-being and Social Welfare, organized by the Banglar Pathshala Foundation. It is a privilege to gather once again in this shared space of learning, reflection, dialogue, uniting researchers, professionals, and independent thinkers from across the continent. Today's session is especially significant, for we have with us Professor Rajat Deb, a leading scholar in the field of social choice theory from Southern Methodist University, Dallas, USA. Over the last several decades, the domain of social choice has shaped the modern discourse on democracy, fairness, collective decision-making. At its philosophical and analytical core stands one of the most profound results in 20th century economics and political theory, Kenneth Arrow's Impossibility Theorem. Arrow's discovery was nothing short of revolutionary. It showed us that under seemingly reasonable fairness conditions, no social choice rule can guarantee a voting system that perfectly converts individual preferences into a collective decision without contradiction. This theorem triggered a transformation in democratic theory. In it, number one, challenged long-held assumptions about majority rule. It established a new analytical standard for fairness in institutions, and it created an entirely new way of thinking about rights, liberty, and welfare. Our session today is an opportunity not merely to revisit Arrow's formal result, but to understand its deeper meaning. Number one, what does this theorem tell us about democracy in real world political systems? And how does it reshape our understanding of constitutional design, voting rules, public reasoning, and institutional accountability? And third, how have scholars such as Professor Sen, Professor Pattanaik, Professor Suzumura, Professor Eric Maskin, and Professor Deb himself extended, questioned, and enriched Arrow's legacy? We are also formulate and honored that Professor Prasanta Pattanaik, one of the world's most respected thinkers in social choice and the author of the introduction to Maskin and Sen's seminal book on Arrow's theorem, is guiding this study circle. Having such a towering scholar as our convener is a privilege that that truly alleviates our collective intellectual journey. Over the past several sessions, we have engaged with ideas of justice, liberty, fairness, and capability, while today's session connects directly with those themes because without understanding how societies translate individual preferences into collective decisions, any discussion on justice or democracy remains incomplete. I encourage all participants to to engage actively, share questions and reflections candidly, and make the most of this rare opportunity to learn from one of the finest thinkers in the field. On behalf of Banglar Pathshala Foundation and all participants, I express our sincere gratitude to Professor Rajat Deb for joining us and reshaping today's lecture based on the needs and backgrounds of the participants, a gesture of remarkable generosity and scholarly humility. With that, I warmly invite Professor Rajat Deb to begin his presentation. Thank you all. Sir, please.
Thank you very much for your kind words. Thank you for inviting me to participate amongst some of the world's leading scholars in the field. I'm truly humbled by your invitation. I have been attending the different sessions so far, and what I find is that because the series has been arranged in honor of Professor Sen, most of the work that has been presented has been on functionings and capabilities approach and on how to operationalize that approach, compare it with other approaches, point out the difficulties that one has with the functionings and capabilities approach. This particular topic is really a prequel to the functions and capabilities approach. It is from the criticism of the informational framework that Arrow provides that the functioning and capabilities approach emerges. So I will not talk about too much about the functionings and capabilities approach, and instead talk about welfare economics as it was before Arrow, present Arrow's theorems, and here is let's see. Well, something is stuck. Let me see whether I can get further. Here is, yeah, now it's working. Here is the outline of what I will be talking about. I will be talking about wealth economics generally. I will be presenting Arrow's Impossibility Theorem. I will be talking about the method that he uses, the axiomatic method. And there have been various approaches, different ways in which one wanted to, in which people have tried to solve Arrow's paradox. I will be focusing on just one such approach. I will be focusing on transitivity and how that approach was used and what results one gets. Now, 1, 2, 3, and 4, those will follow absolutely the traditional thinking and the traditional presentation of the topic. And then I will, as the topic 5 suggests, I will color outside the box. I will give some unorthodox interpretations of the results that I present in 1, 2, 3, and 4. So let me start with talking about welfare economics. If you think about policymaking, we are trying to choose amongst alternative social states. And the choice cannot be solely based on the factual description of the social states. The choice necessarily involves judgments about what is good and what is bad, moral judgments. Thus, policymaking is informed by two types of things: understanding how the world works, understanding a description of what the world looks like, and then deciding what is good so that we can guide the world towards the social state that we want. Thus, moral values, and often conflicting moral values, usually inform policymaking. The examples of such values are social justice, equality, diversity, freedom, social welfare. And these values have to be aggregated, and they usually are, using some political structure: democracy, theocracy, autocracy, custom and tradition, common law. And welfare economics deals primarily with the process of identifying and aggregating possibly conflicting social values. Now, I present a little cartoon based on a law propounded by philosopher David Hume, who said that from an is proposition, that is a proposition about facts, you cannot derive an ought proposition, that is, derive what you should or should not do. Now, if you think about pre-Arrovian welfare economics, the notion of good in economics started with utilitarianism. Goodness of a social state depended on utilities derived by members of society. A cardinal version of utilitarianism is usually attributed to Bentham and Mill and dependent on measurable utility and interpersonal comparisons of utilities, usually utility differences. So if it's measurable and we're wanting to increase the total utility, and a person gains 5, someone loses 3, then comparing the differences, 5 minus 3 is plus 2, and so that's an increase in total utility. Now, by the beginning of the 20th century, economists had been arguing that cardinal utility doesn't really make much sense, and ordinal formulations of utility had replaced the cardinal version, with the utility representing nothing more than the individual's ranking. The approach recognized that other than for unanimous agreement, comparing differences of utility made no sense. Bergson and Samuelson presented a welfare function which said that the social welfare should depend on the individual's rankings, ordinal rankings, or ordinal utilities of individuals. And if you didn't want to compare utilities, the only thing you could say would be that if everybody's utilities increases, then social welfare would increase. But in policymaking, people gain and lose. So how does one make the welfare function operational? Arrow's theorem reflects an attempt to make the Bergson-Samuelson approach operational using something that Arrow himself was interested in, using democracy, using voting procedures. So let me quickly talk about Arrow's impossibility theorem itself, with as little notation as I possibly can. So I will be representing social states by lowercase italics, A, B, C, D, etc. And we will assume that there are at least 3 social states. The individuals in society will be represented by lowercase letters, bold letters or numbers, I, J, K, 1, 2, 3, etc. And individuals' ranking of these social states by columns. For instance, here I show I ranking B over A, J ranking C and D at the same level, and 3 ranking B, C and D at the same level, and A at the bottom. Now, we will assume that these individuals have a ranking of all the possible social states, and these rankings will be denoted by Ri, Rj, R3, etc. Arrow's problem sets out to aggregate the individual's ranking of all possible social states into a social ranking R of these social states. Thus we have members of society 1 through N, and they have rankings 1 through N, R1, R2, R3 to Rn, and that's a preference profile. And what Arrow wants to come out with is to combine these, aggregate these, and come up with a social ranking R. And Arrow, as he himself reports, ever since he was a little child, was interested in the democratic process as visualized by voting. So he starts thinking of what are the main features of voting, the voting process that he would like to capture. And if he could find a reasonable democratic process related to democracy as represented by voting procedures, which can aggregate the individual's ranking R1, R2, R3 to Rn into a social ranking R. So what kind of axioms? Well, first of all, let me point out something. Now, it's already been emphasized that R1, R2, R3, and Rn, these social preferences can be interpreted in various ways. And depending on how you interpret those individual preferences, whether they are utilities, selfish preferences, ethical preferences, whether they are individuals' preferences that emerge from discussions with each other, will clearly affect what kind of axioms are suitable for imposition. For Arrow, he thought of R1, R2, R3, Rn. He is not very precise about what they represent, other than he thinks of them as preferences over social alternatives as they emerge after individuals engage in preliminary discussions with each other about what should be done. Now, Arrow was interested in democracy. So the opposite of democracy, of course, is dictatorship. And so Arrow puts forward a notion of what a dictator is. And for Arrow, a dictator is a unique individual, so one individual, such that no matter what the preferences that are being expressed, what the preference profile is, if he or she ranks one alternative over another, strictly over another. So if the individual says A is better than B, then the social ranking under the aggregation rule will preserve his ranking. That is, if the dictator ranks A over B, then society should rank A over B. If the dictator ranks B over C, then society should rank B over C. So whatever the dictator's ranking over the pair of alternatives, as long as the dictator has a strict preference of one social state over another, then that ranking will be reflected in society's ranking in the social preference. Arrow imposed some other reasonable looking conditions, axioms, on the aggregation procedure. The first one was unrestricted domain, that's sense terminology, which says that no matter what preference profile you threw at this aggregation rule, it should come up with an answer, some social ranking R. That's pretty reasonable. The second one was the weak Pareto criterion, which says that if individuals in society unanimously agree on the ranking of two alternatives, then one over the other, strictly over the other, then the social ranking should reflect that ranking. So if everybody thinks A is better than B, then so should society. If everybody thinks E is better than G, then so should society. So that's a pretty innocuous assumption. The third assumption is the independence of irrelevant alternatives, and the assumption says that the social ranking of any two individuals depends only on the individual's ranking over those two social states. Which means when you're, now this is kind of what happens when you're voting. If you're voting over whether to choose individual 1 or individual 2, then all you do is count the votes for individual 1, compare it with the number of votes that individual 2 gets, and then say who has more votes. Now, if there had been an individual 3, how individual 3 would have been ranked by individuals, how 1, 2, and 3 would have been ranked vis-a-vis each other would not matter. To see the kind of rule that is being eliminated by this assumption of independence of irrelevant alternatives, consider the type of rule that's used in sports, where you have a league being played, and not only when you rank a team, not only do you see how it does against some other team, let's say when you look at A's performance, you see how many matches A has won, how many matches A has drawn, how many A has lost. So not only the performance against another single team, but it takes into consideration the performance against all the other teams. And it is that kind of rule, sort of rule that's been emphasized by Borda, known as Borda point count method, that is eliminated by the independence of irrelevant alternatives. So, given that, Arrow's impossibility theorem says that an aggregation rule that satisfies the three axioms, 1, 2, and 3, will have a dictator. And that was found to be paradoxical, because on their own, 1, 2, and 3 certainly 1 and 2, and 3, if you're wanting to look at voting rules, seem reasonable rules. They eliminate interpersonal comparisons, but that's fine because you have ordinal preferences. You want results, so you want unrestricted domain. And 2 is the innocuous assumption that if everybody agrees on the strict ranking of 2 alternatives, so should society. So the result was viewed as somewhat of a paradox. So let me talk a little bit, and of course, and the different people's attempts to resolve this paradox resulted in what is known as modern social choice theory. So if you think of it, this result is the prequel to all of social choice theory as we know it today. So let me talk about Arrow's method, the so-called axiomatic method, the Arrow-Debreu method. And the method consists of some undefined or informally defined concepts, like Arrow's individual rankings or preferences, some formal axioms defining the relationship between these concepts. Now, clearly, the appeal of these axioms would depend on the interpretation, the undefined, making those undefined concepts more precise by interpreting them. But nevertheless, even on these undefined concepts or ill-defined concepts or vaguely defined concepts, you can impose formal axioms. And from formal axioms, you can derive logical conclusions. Now, this method has some advantages. One advantage is if one reinterprets the underlying concepts and imposes the axioms, then the logical conclusions reinterpreted remains valid. Secondly, this method itself can be used in other models which are tackling presumably different problems. And particularly when that model can be shown to be mathematically equivalent. Let me give you 2 examples. Example A, consider an ordinal version of the Human Development Index aggregation problem. Suppose R1 is the standard of living. If it was cardinal, I would say it's per capita income. But suppose we don't believe that per capita income represents the standard of living, but we can describe if the standard of living is increasing or decreasing, or compare standards of living across countries. Suppose R2 is health span, not lifespan, not how long you will live, but how long you will have a healthy life. Considerably more difficult to measure than how long an average person lives in a society. Let's say R3 is the average educational attainment. Not just the highest grade a child born today is expected to attain, because you know, I, as a person who's been involved with education for a long time, strongly believe that very often education has nothing to do with the highest grade, the highest degree that you attain. So what if we imposed Arrow's 3 axioms and tried to combine that into an ordinal version of the Human Development Index? What Arrow's theorem tells us that if we did that, that will make us focus on one of the 3. Perhaps we'll only be looking at per capita income, perhaps we'll only be looking at health span, or perhaps we'll only be looking at the average educational attainment in making our judgment about social states. So that is what's impossible. It's impossible to combine the three ordinarily viewed if those three axioms are imposed to get a human development index. Now notice that this criticism does not apply if we expand the informational basis to include cardinal measurement. But even then, one must make clear what kind of sort of interpersonal comparability assumptions we are making to arrive at the index R. Let me look at example B, and this really represents an even more important example, an application of Arrow's theorem. When you're voting, often people realize that voting honestly does not give one the result that one wants, that voting strategically, so even though you like candidate A, if you think candidate A does not have a chance of winning, you sometimes vote for candidate B, less preferred candidate, because the outcome of B winning would be better than some other person winning. In general, if we are looking at mechanisms, one can ask what sort of mechanism, voting mechanisms or not, would be cheat proof, where individuals recognize by expressing dishonest opinions, by cheating, one get an outcome that is more desirable for them. Now, it appears at first sight this has nothing to do with Arrow's theorem. But if one looks at the literature, and this is of course one of the most important theorems in economics, the Gibbard-Satterthwaite theorem, not only if you look at Gibbert's original proof, it's an application of Arrow's theorem, Arrow's proof, by showing that the structure with some minimal assumptions satisfies Arrow's condition, and therefore the only cheat-proof mechanism that can exist is dictatorial. In fact, it can be shown the Gibbard-Satterthwaite theorem is mathematically, in fact, equivalent to Arrow's theorem. So let me move on to the implications of relaxing some of Arrow's assumptions. So no one has, as far as I know, suggested that we give up voting altogether or that we give up democracy altogether, but rather have instead asked which of Arrow's axioms is weakest, and can we resolve Arrow's impossibility paradox by relaxing one or more of those assumptions. And people have tried, and a lot of those assumptions have been relaxed with I would say, not much success. But that's my personal opinion. I will just look at one strand of the literature, which looks at the assumption of the social preference not being a ranking, that is, not being transitive. So what happens if one relaxes the assumption that whenever we say X is socially as good as Y and Y is socially as good as Z, X should be at least as socially good as Z. So what if R is not transitive in this sense? Can Arrow's paradox be resolved? What happens to the paradox? What happens to the dictatorial power structure that Arrow describes. To better understand what happens to the dictatorial power structure when we relax the transitive R, we introduce two concepts. The first one is that of a vetour, similar to but distinct from Arrow's dictator, and the concept of an oligarchy. First, the vetour. And I will talk about what the vetour is, and then I will just compare it with Arrow's notion of a dictator. And you will see the difference between the two. Any individual for whom all pairs of social states and all preference profiles, when the individual strictly ranks one social state over another, if that ranking cannot be reversed under the aggregate social preference, then the person is a vetour. If that ranking has to be maintained by the aggregate social preference, then that individual is a dictator. So if the dictator can impose his strict social preference on society, that is what a dictator is. A vetour is a person who can prevent a strict preference from being imposed by society. With that, using that concept, we can talk about an oligarchy. Now, the term oligarchy has its own intuitive meaning, and the way it's been used in social choice is somewhat different. So oligarchy in social choice is the smallest group of vetoers who are decisive, that is, exercise dictatorial power. So to be the dictator, they must all agree, but each individual in that group can veto a social strict decision. Now, this notion of oligarchy is a little bit different because in our normal interpretation of oligarchy, we assume that this group is a small group of individuals who enforce their power on a larger population. In social choice, that is not necessarily so. And when I interpret the result that we get when we relax transitivity, I will provide you with two different interpretations of the oligarchy result. All of the sense provides an intuitive factorization of transitivity of the social preference relation R as consisting of two parts. One is the transitivity of the strict preference relation, PPP, which is if X is strictly better than Y, Y is strictly better than Z, then X is strictly better than Z. And III, if A is indifferent to B and B is indifferent to C, then A is indifferent to C. They're both assumptions on triples, which says preference, the first one says preference is transitive, A better than B, B better than C, A better than C. And the second is indifference is transitive, A and B are at the same level, B and C are at the same level, then A and C are at the same level. So let us examine what happens if we give up these assumptions. And one of the reasons one way want to give up these assumptions is think of the social preference. There is no individual behind it unless one think of a social planner. If one thinks of a social planner, there's a reason for us to impose transitivity of both preference and indifference. But if one does not think of R being a result, something that the social planner is imposing, then there's no reason to impose PPP and II arbitrarily as something that should come out of a voting process or an aggregation process. So giving up III gives us what I've called the Gibbard-Sen theorem. It's reportedly proved by Gibbard in a seminar organized by Professor Sen and reported by Professor Sen in his textbook. He shows that instead of a dictatorship, what we get is an oligarchy. A group of individuals, each one of them have the veto power to prevent society from ranking one alternative strictly over another, and together to be decisive. Together, if they unanimously decide, they can get one alternative ranked strictly above another. If such a group is small, then it corresponds to the traditional notion of an oligarchy. If the oligarchies go back a long time. If you think of, and I always get my dates wrong, if you think of the triumvirates around 60 BC, I believe, Caesar, Lepidus, Octavian, or after Caesar was killed, Antony, Lepidus, and Octavian, the triumvirate, the three of them together ruled Rome. If together they were decisive, and each one had the power to veto a decision. So this traditional notion of what an oligarchy looked like. And it's a small group that controls social decision making. But what if this group is large? There's nothing in the definition that can prevent that group from consisting of all the individuals. So if you require for a social decision to be taken, a positive social decision, something ranked above another, for all individuals to agree, otherwise rank them equally, then you have an oligarchy consisting of all individuals of society. Then the notion of oligarchy is that the power is so diffused that the social ranking is unresponsive. Social power is so diffused that social decision-making becomes virtually impossible. So now let's ask what happens. What if we give up PPP altogether? So what if we give up insisting that P is transitive, if we allow P to cycle around? I will follow the argument of Marquis de Condorcet to argue that that leads to instability in society. This can be illustrated by Condorcet paradox. And in context of Arrow's theorem, the paradox plays an important role because Arrow talks about it and he uses the Condorcet's paradox to prove his theorem. The paradox is so elegant, it's so simple. Let me present the sort of instability that the Condorcet paradox, also known as the voting paradox, can result in. So what happens is the collective preference will be cyclical. A majority prefers one option over another, which in turn is preferred to a third option, but the third option is preferred over the first. So look at a very simple case of three individuals, 1, 2, and 3, with preferences as shown. One's preference A over B over C, 2's B over C over A, and so on. Now, what would happen if A is selected in the society? Bad things would happen. It would be unstable because A is opposed in favor of C by 2/3 of the individual. So if you look at C being ranked over A by individuals 2 and 3, A should not be picked because it would make 2/3 of the society unhappy. What if you picked C? That would not work if you look at the highlighted areas. 1 and 2 prefer B over C. Again, 2/3 of the individuals wouldn't like C to be picked. And similarly, 2/3 of the individuals wouldn't want B to be picked. So if A, B, and C were the three alternatives, anything that is picked would be unstable, with 2/3 of the individuals wanting to replace it. You may think that this is peculiar. There are two ways out of it. We could, 2/3 is perhaps too small a fraction of society. What if it's 99% of the individuals? And I assure you, you can construct a voting paradox with 99% or 999 out of 1,000 individuals opposing every alternative. You may also argue that this is not really sort of democracy because, for instance, in Bangladesh or in many countries, democracy is indirect. So we elect a parliament, and the parliament elects, legislates and makes rules and makes selections. All I can say is I can guarantee that even in a parliamentary democracy, you can have cases where the majority, the vast majority, and you can pick whatever majority you like, people will oppose a duly elected parliament, duly elected by majorities of individuals, passes laws. And those laws, each one of those laws would be not to the liking of the vast majority of the individuals. Such is the strength of these voting paradoxes. So now one comes to the question, okay, we know that these cycles and strict preferences can lead to instability, whether it's direct voting or representative voting. What if one rules out rules which give us these preference cycles? Well, Sen looks at another aspect of democracy. So Arrow was concerned about democracy, and for Arrow, democracy was the representation of the majority of individuals' will as expressed through voting. Sen argued that liberal democracy has another aspect, and that is the aspect of individual rights, and he cites Mill, John Stuart Mill, as pointing out that individuals have personal spheres and that individual autonomy, individual liberty, individual freedom is as much a part of liberal democracy as representing the majority's opinion. The right to exert influence in one's personal sphere is an essential part of liberal democracy. For instance, how much chili you add to your fish curry should not be society's business. That should be in your personal sphere. It should be none of anybody else's business. And Mill described that as his harm principle and said, and I'm quoting him, the only purpose for which power can be rightfully exercised over any member of a civilized community against his will is to prevent harm to others. So it depends on what you mean by harm. So if I add more chili paste to my fish curry, I can reasonably argue that if nobody else eats it, it harms no one else. So I should be allowed to do it. And sort of minimal autonomy, minimal exercise of my rights should let me do that. Sen uses this notion to define the notion of minimal liberty as requiring the existence of at least two individuals who could be decisive over some pair of social states. So presumably, if one looks at social states that differ only in respect to something in the individual's personal sphere, then her autonomy should allow her to decide. And Sen argues that minimal liberty should require at least two individuals to have such personal spheres over which they can decide. And that's minimal liberty. Now, I know that a number of individuals, I must say, myself included, do not quite fully agree with Sen's conception of liberty. But let us, for the moment, take this conception of liberty. Then using this, Sen proves what has been certainly one of his most recognized results. In his Impossibility of the Puritan Liberal 1970, Sen shows, ruling out strict preference cycles, that the Pareto principle is inconsistent with the existence of minimal liberty. So the two notions of democracy, the Pareto principle representing majority of people's opinion, and minimal liberty protecting individual autonomy, there is some tension between the two. So now what I will do is I will, as I said, draw outside the box. When I was a little child and I attended school, I was always asked to draw within the lines, and that never seemed interesting to me. So I just drew wherever I wanted because that was more interesting. So I have not really, unlike others who have presented in this series, I haven't really, other than briefly talking about some voting paradoxes, I've never really presented any of my own research. So I will present now my personal opinions, and they are opinions, and they are what I think should be learned from Arrow's theorems and from the results that I have presented so far. So I'm going to be coloring outside the box, and my reading of Arrow's theorem is, it is a warning of perils that electoral democracies not will, but may face as it attempts to aggregate individual preferences, I should probably add using voting. So if one uses voting procedures to aggregate individual preferences, here are some of the problems that this kind of democracy may face. Number one, the dictatorship. So you can get electoral autocracies. And I would like my audience to look all around the world, and I think you will not have a problem finding electoral autocracies where individuals have elected people, and I'm not including China or Russia, where there are no sort of not real elections, but there are many other countries where individuals have been elected who essentially have dictatorial power. Number two, reducing what should be a multidimensional approach to policy to a policy target results in reduction to a policy target with a single dimension. So you will find that politicians often talk about one thing. How fast has GDP grown? What has happened to per capita income? What has happened to unemployment? They tend to focus on one thing. And because talking about what should be a multidimensional approach is so difficult. And by the way, aggregating multidimensional factors is also, in my opinion, very difficult. Number 3, cheating, corruption, and manipulation of the electoral system. It's rampant in many countries. Oligarchic concentration of power. Now, that could be a few individuals, few favored individuals making the decisions, or indecisiveness and insensitivity, unresponsiveness of social preferences to individual preferences. Nothing is getting done. 5, political instability. Parties coming to power and at the same time being unpopular. Number 6, violation of individual rights and liberties by democratic parties brought to power. And I think my coloring outside the box is that I read Arrow's theorem as pointing out that these perils can possibly arise if you adopt the electoral process as a method of aggregating social preferences. So what should we do? Should we give up electoral democracy? My opinion is certainly not. Here I agree with one of my least favorite historical characters and some of my favorite economists. I quote Winston Churchill, one of my less favorite historical characters for the way he behaved in India. Many forms of government have been tried and will be tried in this world of sin and woe. No one pretends that democracy is perfect or all-wise. Indeed, it has been said that democracy is the worst form of government, excepting for all those other forms that have been tried and from time to time. And that's Winston Churchill, and I sort of agree with that. And if you want a formal description of something similar, I strongly recommend the results of Maskin and Dasgupta that you will find reported in Maskin and Sen, wonderfully summarized by Professor Pattanaik in his introduction in the Arrow Impossibility Theorem. I'm not going to try and summarize the result. So, my conclusion: democracy needs institutional guardrails. And I am supportive, strongly supportive. And if you ask me during question and answer, I can relate some anecdotes to you about this. The basic structure principle of constitutional supremacy that was adopted in India and that has been adopted in Bangladesh. It is the constitution is supreme and the parliament can amend the constitution but cannot destroy it. It's Anwar Hussain Chaudhry versus Bangladesh 1989. It's been adopted by Bangladesh. The basic structure of Bangladesh is a parliamentary democracy with unicameral legislature, the Jatiya সংসদ, and a separation of powers amongst executive, legislative, and judicial branches. Key features include popular sovereignty, unitary state, democracy, a republican government, and fundamental rights as enshrined in the Constitution, which cannot be amended in a way that alters its core principles. The fundamental principles being nationalism, socialism, democracy, secularism are four of these fundamental principles of the state. I hope someone will correct me. I'm not an expert on Bangladeshi legal system. Someone will correct me if I'm wrong. But my opinion is that something of this sort, the basic structure, is needed to protect democracy by providing it with institutional guardrails to make sure that it works in the way that it's supposed to. Thank you.
Thank you so very much, Professor Rajat Deb, for your excellent, clear, and provocative statements. These are all new ideas and fresh views. I'm very delighted that distinguished economist, Professor Dr. Kaushik Bosu joined us today. So, as usual, after the lecture, the speaker was giving rest for 5 to 7 minutes to have a cup of tea or water. And then may I invite Professor Kaushik Bosu to say something on Professor Rajat Deb's presentation.
Thank you very much. I was planning to watch it quietly and not say anything. But now that you've asked, Ronnie, thank you very much. Rajat, what an excellent lecture. I have to say it was bringing back memories of olden days. Your first part was, of course, revision for me, but such clear revision, it's useful for when I lecture as well. I wanted to do a little bit of I was quite fascinated by your own thoughts that you brought in the end. And in that spirit, one question that has been of interest to me for a long time, which goes outside the box of this kind of exercise, it may also be of some interest to Prasanta Pattanaik, Professor Pattanaik, who's here. I want to raise this. You know, when we talk of all this entire exercise from Arrow, Sen, and the whole lot, several of these people are here in the audience, we take individual as having a preference. And the sanctity or not depends on that. But I have often thought in the domain of liberty, you become aware of different kinds of preference. And I think that's very important. Take the example that you're adding of adding chili to your food or salt to your food and someone else objecting. This makes me acutely aware that who is objecting and what is the motivation should also matter. If it is my mother who gets troubled by my adding salt to my food and votes against. And if it is Robert Kennedy, who in principle is against it and votes against, one should matter and the other should not matter. This is actually, I think, conceptually quite important, because lots of things which we generally, people who believe in individual liberty, and I also do, I'm aware that depending on who is objecting and what the motivation is, some objections we have to pay respect to. The person I choose to marry, typically we take that no one else should have an opinion on it. But it depends on who has the opinion. If the person with the opinion is getting wounded by my decision, we should pay respect. And if the person is doing it mechanically, we shouldn't. Therefore, we have to create a world where we allow the motivation behind the preference to play some role or not play some role. I'm not saying it too articulately, but I wanted to just put this thought on the table. That's it.
Excellent idea, sir. Thank you so much. May I now invite Professor Prasanta Pattanaik to comment or say something on both of these two great economists? Sir, please unmute.
Yes.
Yes.
Well, I very much enjoyed Rajat's lecture, a sweeping lecture which surveys a vast area. I just wanted to ask one question. Now, the entire literature is concerned with maximizing something, and either we call it welfare or by whatever name you call it. Now, there is an alternative way of thinking about social decisions. One of the advocates I have listened to, who was persuasive in many ways, he said that you people are talking about a type of problem which I don't agree with. He said that society is something like a housing association. We form the housing association to set some rules so as to prevent very gross type of behavior or outcome. But then the housing association doesn't ask me the question, what are you doing inside your house? Or what are you thinking about? Or what is your motivation, etc. It sets the rules. And then subject to those rules, the purpose is to avoid certain very bad type of problems. And then you can do whatever you like. It is to some extent, he has a point, and which is something like Mill's point. Only thing, Mill has been interpreted in the literature as concerned only with the right to privacy. Mill was concerned probably with a broader issue, that he was talking about things which harm other people, and harm he was careful to specify, tangible harm. Just you're resenting what I'm eating, or you're resenting the idea and getting offended, that doesn't count. It should be tangible. Now, of course, there is a problem of defining tangibility of harm, but he was offering a Mill type of interpretation to society. It is there to prevent somebody causing tangible harm to others. And in those things, society has a right to interfere. But otherwise, this notion of maximizing something called social welfare, so that we look at everything, including to what extent his preference is being satisfied, what his preferences are, he thought it's a rather objectionable type of formulation. I have some sympathy with that we are trying to visualize the society as if day to day it is continuously adjusting things so as to maximize something called welfare. Instead, one can view as society concerned with preventing some things which can be argued as very bad outcomes. And Mill was concerned with that sort of problem, not the Mill of utilitarianism, but the Mill has another book, as you know, on liberty. He was advocating that sort of role for the society. Now, I would like to see what Roger thinks about that.
Okay. Thank you, sir. And And on Professor Kaushik Bushu's comment on the motivation behind the choices of an individual. Would you like to say something on this?
Well, the harm principle, I think one of the problems with it is we should apply, by the way, Kaushik, to your example, with whether someone else is being hurt or not, whether they have a right to object, is the difficulty of sometimes interpreting it. Now, think of this case that happened in India where a deity lost, I mean literally, lost a head, and the person went to the Supreme Court and asked whether for an order for the head to be restored. And the judge said that the person should pray and not approach the Supreme Court, and instead approach the archaeological survey to see whether something could be done. Now, the person was hurt, and there was no question that he was hurt. So should the Supreme Court judge have made such a comment? Probably not. But how do you apply the harm principle? Was he harmed? Sometimes it is a...
Can I jump in with a comment?
Yes,
Yes.
Yes.
Yeah. This kind of thing, yes, this is a very tricky one, troublesome one. But there are cases which comes up in everyday life. Let's say that I want to have, if I'm thinking of a gay marriage, and someone takes a view that that will not be allowed, we treat all such views with most modern people with complete dismissal. Another person can't pass judgment. But to me, when a politician says that I can't have a gay marriage, and when my mother says, because my mother is hurt by it, the two have to be put on different pedestals and evaluated. You may still decide to overrule, but there is a difference between the two kinds of objections. So, therefore, the fact that we associate the individual preference ranking in the head as a unique, well defined thing, to me, those need to be classified. Preferences which come from my nosiness or whatever, and preference that comes from my inner being hurt, a mother could be hurt. Those things have to be treated differently, is the thought that I'm bringing. And your example is, I suppose, very similar. And in fact, more troubling because it's in a bigger domain it's happening.
Thank you, sir. May I request Professor Maurice Saleh to comment on Professor Rajat Deb's presentation? Sir, please unmute. Yes. Yes.
Yes, okay. Well, I have a question on the technical part of arrow theorem regarding IIA, because I think Rajat has not discussed really IIA. And for me, it's a most critical assumption, which is, of course, which is made here by Arrow. By the way, even Arrow had problems with IIA, since in the counterexample he gave in his book and his papers, he rarely gave a formally correct counterexample. I think only once he has a correct counterexamples. Otherwise, he is using some kind of independence of irrelevant alternatives, which is not the one he has defined. So I was asking Rajat about this question.
Well, it's really what you're looking at is border versus Condorcet. Now, which of your countrymen do you want to support? Now, if you give up IIA, you can go in the border direction, point count methods and so on, but they too have a lot of problems. If you believe in ordinal preferences, the assignment of points, you can assign points in a way that you can get anything that you want. You can get any ranking. You can reverse rankings. You can get any ranking. So would those rankings mean anything? You can give up IIA. I'm not supporting IIA, but IIA seems quite natural if you think in terms, as Arrow was, in terms of voting between individuals. It's a natural assumption to make if you're wanting to rule out interpersonal comparability, if you're wanting to be ordinal, and if you're wanting to focus on voting. Is it his weakest assumption? Probably. So, and in terms of what Professor Pattanaik and Professor Zhu and others have been saying, the interpretation of what those individual preferences are is critical. So whether you get from Arrow to functionings and capabilities, whether the description of the social state should matter in its evaluation or not, I think is a critical question. And here, Kaushik, your red plus
Yes.
blue plus business.
Can I bring in one thought into what Professor Sals said? It's lovely to see people after such a long time. One thought, Rajat, whether independence of irrelevant alternatives, one thing one can think of is between I prefer A to B, but now if there are many other things, X, Y, Z, which are in between A to B, or there are very few, one can treat that as a sign of the gap between A and B. So one can say that the independence of irrelevant alternatives ought to be modified, because if lots of things come in between those two, that is saying
Yes.
something about the distance. I wonder if there's
Yes.
any thought on that. Yeah.
Yes, it suggests that there's information that is being ignored. But how to add that information and what information should be added, can one just do some sort of a rank order thing or not, is not clear to me at all. Because those numbers, if it's ordinal, don't really mean anything.
Yeah.
Thank you. And may I invite Professor Shati Narayan, who wrote an excellent book, Unequal, and is a university teacher. Shati Appa, may I request you to say something on Professor Rajat Deb's presentation?
Thank you so much, Ronnie. I am sorry I had computer problems, so I wasn't able to hear the previous answer. But this was such an excellent presentation. So I don't know if you've already answered it, and thank you for this. But my only question is, what happens to minority rights in majoritarian situations? That's my only question. Thank you.
Well, the question of rights itself is an interesting question, and as you know, it has evolved over time. rights have to be protected, just not minority rights, all sorts of human rights. You know this prohibition in the United States Constitution against cruel and unusual punishment. You're, I think, a lawyer or a law student. But I don't know whether you know where it comes from. It's the case where is the Bishop of Rochester in 1581. His cook is during the time of Henry VIII. His cook apparently tried to poison him with porridge, but the holy bishop was fasting, so he was not poisoned. He lived to be executed by Henry later in the Tower of London. But the cook managed to poison some of the guests, two of whom died, the rest were very sick. And in the UK, the parliament was, at that time, the UK has this parliamentary supremacy. So you can do anything it wants. So it was getting there, but the king still, Henry VIII, still exerted a lot of power. So Henry was afraid of being poisoned because of his position against, he wanted to get married, Anne Boleyn and all that business. And so he was afraid of being poisoned. And so he made the act of poisoning seditious, went to the parliament, got the parliament to enact a law saying poisoning was sedition, and the punishment for poisoning would be being boiled in water. And this cook was caught and boiled. And the parliament then realized later on that this was completely unacceptable, and you got that right of not being subject to cruel and unusual punishment. So that's the Duke of Rochester's story. But the rights evolve, rights, people recognize that they've made mistakes, and rights evolve. And it's not till the late 1930s that we even talked about what human rights were. And rights of minorities are usually just human rights in another form.
Miss Sabikun Nahar is here. So may I request Sabikun Nahar to ask question or any comments you have on the presentation of Professor Deb?
Thank you so much. Thank you so much, Professor, for a nice presentation. I actually got my answer when he talks about the minority right issues, but still now I'm a little curious about the implications of real-world examples. For example, in the case of elections or collective decision makings or committees formations. So in those cases, how do errors conditions can be a solution, or we could apply in these conditions? For example, if we talk about the ranked choice voting system, where the winner can change if a non-winning candidate withdraws, which actually values the independence of irrelevant alternatives conditions. So in that case, I'm just a little curious, how do you implement the errors concepts here?
Well, I'm not saying that what Arrow points out is the problem of trying to get things done democratically. And what, in my opinion, and people may disagree, what must have is a respect for rules that one mutually agrees to, and that one shouldn't throw them out just because one can. it is difficult in a place like India and Bangladesh with a relatively short history where conventions are often ignored, or the United States, where conventions are often ignored, because it takes time for respect for how things are done now, for respect for conventions to develop that protect democracy and prevent it from going off the rails.
Okay. Thank you so very much. Thank you.
Now, may I invite Siula Rafael? Would you like to say something on Professor Rajat Deb's presentation?
Well, I mean, to be sincere, I don't have much to add, or I'm just listening to the presentation. Which was very interesting. Then maybe I will read the literature and try to make clear my thoughts. Maybe I can get back by mail if the Professor Deb allows me to write him. That's it.
Of
I
course.
apologize. Thank you.
Sure,
Thank you very much.
sure. Thank you. Kishore Kanal, Professor Kishore Kanal.
Okay. Thank you, Professor Rajat Deb, for your wonderful lecture. I have one question for you. Is there any linkage between this Eros impossibility theorem and quality of life of people? On assessing quality of life of people?
The quality of life issue I commented on when I talked about the difficulty of constructing a human development index and what you throw in there, whether, for instance, how a female does in a society should matter. What do you put in there? How do you weight it? What is the reason for you to attaching different weights? And I personally believe that the weights that one, for particular countries, it would depend on what the problems of that country are, the weights that you attach. I'm somewhat of a marginalist in that we should focus on the biggest problems that we are facing and then try to improve on those. And Professor Pattanaik, not maximize, but just make things a little bit better. Even if it's minority rights, make the minority rights a little bit better. If it's empowerment of females, see what we can do to make it a little bit better. So I would be looking for improvements.
Okay, thank you, sir.
May I request Chiranjit Das to say something on the presentation of Professor Rajat Deb?
Well, thank you for giving me this space, but I have joined very lately. I came home very lately. I was outside, so it's not. I haven't heard that of much, so I don't want to comment right now. So I will go through the slides and the recording next time.
Sure.
But thank you for
Thank you.
Let me entertain you with two repeating two incidents. First, they both are a little bit autobiographical. The first one has to do with, I, of course, learned my social choice first from Professor Pattanaik, 1972, and then at the LSE from almost to that later on the same year. First, let me repeat what happened in 1972. It was the first time Professor Pattanaik was teaching his course on collective choice in the spring of 72. And in the class had started. It was fairly technical class that was going on. In the class, we knew each other more or less as a group of 8 or 10 students. We found sitting at the background, in the back of the class, some strange people. Later on, they came there for a few times and then disappeared. It was just too technical for them. Later on, we discovered they were people that were being sent by the then Prime Minister, Mrs. Gandhi, to find out what was going on in a class of collectors. They wanted to find out. They were really curious because that was the time that Mrs. Gandhi was trying to consolidate power and impose emergency. So the second story is, so I joined LSE and I was very excited because Professor Arrow he was given the choice. He could talk about whatever he wanted. And he was to give his first seminar, and he had just written his book with Professor Hahn on general equilibrium. And of course, he at that time, he had this enormous contribution that he had made to economics, and he was told, you can talk on anything that you want. And there was this big auditorium full of students, and I was, what is he going to talk on? What is talk going to be on? And of course, it was on his impossibility result. So he just loved his result. And since then, I've seen him when he's asked to deliver a lecture, he wants to talk about his impossibility result.
Yeah, thank you. And I can share that in the reason I am interested in this study circle, individual well-being and social welfare, because of Professor Kaushik Basu's eloquent lecture in Amartya Sen Study Circle, where he spoke so vividly, and I was so motivated by his lecture. I can recall it was the 11th session of Amartya Sen Study Circle on social choice theory. So, actually, it is a great pleasure that it is Professor Kaushik Basu who motivated me by his lecture. And this entire study circle has been organized out of that enthusiasm. So, so thank you. And Professor Pattanaik, would you like to say something on the whole discussion? Because today's lecture is a break of what is continuing from session 1. So please, if you feel something to say, please.
Can I ask a question?
Yes, sure.
How we look at arrow type of problem in its relation to our concern about what is well-being and how do we evaluate individual well-being, whether we should interpret that as utility or whether we should interpret that in terms of some valued attributes like being well nourished, etc. Now, I would like Rajat to comment on that if possible. If time permits, I won't take too much time. I shall come to the point. Now, as I look at it, the entire capability approach is concerned with and how we evaluate an individual's well-being and why do we need that in order to judge whether social welfare is being promoted or not. We want to take into account the individual's well-being. Now, as I look at it, the controversy is at a different level. The controversy is at the level of Bergson-Samuelson versus Arrow, the two approaches. Bergson and Samuelson are considering the question of an individual's value judgments regarding individual well-being or social well-being, etc. Now, as far as I can see, they were not concerned with Arrow's problem at all. They were concerned with the individual judgment. Therefore, it's a question of an individual's judgment, value judgment. How do we criticize it or agree with it? What are the sort of agreement? What are the sort of arguments we bring into it? So it is what may be called deliberative democracy. Before the final voting is taken, we go through extensive debates. Should we undertake land reform or not? Now there we enter into extensive debate, what would land reform do, whether it's good or bad. It is related to that particular issue. Now, after everything has been discussed, then if we still disagree, there is nothing we can do excepting what Rajat said, leave it to the decision-making mechanism, some version of majority decision. But the discussion is not about the decision method. Discussion is about the value judgments. Why do we agree? Why do we agree with Sen that, okay, utility as individual well-being is a rather unpersuasive argument? And that cannot be answered by resorting to democratic decision method. It's a question of ethical criticism. And therefore, it should not be interpreted as a matter of democratic decision, which is sometimes being put on that. Would Rajat like to comment on that?
Absolutely, I agree with you. You're talking about the sort of discussion that should take place, and it is here that the ability to persuade, the freedom of the press, the access to information, that all that should play a part. And more importantly, the idea, whether it's Rawls or Harsanyi, of putting yourself in somebody else's shoes. The ability to put yourself in somebody else's shoes when you express your judgment, it becomes important. So for you to say that I support minority rights, when I say I support minority rights, it's not because I am a minority, but because I can put myself in that minority's shoes and I can see that how my well-being would be affected if I was treated in that particular way.
Yes, in particular, it would be a very bad defense of whether I'm defending utilitarianism or whether I'm criticizing utilitarianism. It would be a very bad defense to say that, look, the majority thinks that happiness should be maximized and happiness constitutes well-being, and therefore I believe that happiness should be interpreted as well-being. It would be a very bad justification. Here I have to go to more fundamental justification by appealing to the value judgment and offering value criticism. Frequently, there is a tendency to say switch from one thing to another. As soon as there is a problem about interpersonal comparison, there is a temptation to say, okay, I shall go by consensus. That's hardly an ethical justification. The fact that the majority thinks well-being should not be interpreted as happiness, that is hardly a justification for saying well-being should not be treated as happiness at that level. That's what you would be saying that?
Professor Pattanaik, that's why I was saying that these ideas of basic structure, which by the way has been rejected by many countries, becomes important. In India, in 1967, in a case, Golaknath 1967, the High Court declared that the things that were protected, basic rights that were protected in Part 3 of the Indian Constitution, could not be changed by the Parliament. The Parliament had a right to amend, but not to destroy. And particularly in countries which do not have a long tradition of respect for the Constitution, I think something like that is needed.
I would entirely agree with you.
Professor Rajat Deb, is the basic structure principle is something like Immanuel Kant's a priori thing that that it will pre-exist or it is out of
It should be out of the control of the Parliament.
Control of the Parliament, right? It cannot be amended.
No, the argument that was actually made in the Indian Supreme Court, which won the day by an eminent lawyer, was that suppose because Mrs. Gandhi controls the vast majority in both houses, she gets the house to both the Lok Sabha and the Rajya Sabha to declare the current queen to be the Queen of India. Can that be done? And the Supreme Court said, no, that cannot be done. So it is to show that there are limits that should be imposed on popular parliamentary democracy. And those limits are in some sense ethical limits.
That's excellent. So we are near the end of our session. If anyone, Professor Maurice Saleh, you want to comment on the later discussions? You want to say something?
Well, I think nobody has mentioned the question of restricted preferences. And this was the main road to escape Arrow's theorem in the 70s and the 60s, 70s with papers by Amartya Sen and Prasanta Pattanaik and other people at the time. And all started with Duncan Black, who has not been mentioned either. And I think we should evoke the name of Duncan Black in that matter. Nothing else to add. Thank you.
Yeah, so that's for Professor Pattanaik to comment on whether there are regularities exist in preferences such that these problems will not arise.
Professor Pattanaik, please unmute and then respond.
Yes.
So our
One
preference
reason,
is single-peaked.
yes. One reason why that died out is a very fundamental paper by Kramer, Econometrica. They showed that if individual preferences have some very plausible type of differences, very plausible, then this doesn't work in a multidimensional case. The restricted preference approach seems plausible and black type of case where there is a single dimension by which the alternatives are being judged by all the individuals, more rightist or more leftist, or more of defense expenditure or less of defense expenditure. When there are multiple dimensions, then even some moderate differences between individuals destroys that plausibility. So that's why it died out. And though I did work on it for quite some time, I, to some extent, agree that it deserved to die out. Because if with even very moderate differences, it doesn't work, then it doesn't provide much of an escape. So I agree with Maurice that it is not being discussed, but I believe that for right reasons, it is not being discussed very much these days.
Yeah. Can I ask one thing? That actually, when we were when the capability approach and the capability views stream of sessions and your impossibility theorem, Arrow's impossibility theorem's view, how these two links together, because earlier you have explained it, and because of my some inability, and can you just explain lucidly that how capability approach view and the Arrow's impossibility, these two are linked together?
So basically what Professor Sen is arguing is that the problem that Arrow is encountering, because he is limiting the informational basis from which he is trying to evaluate social states, and that the description of the social state itself should be important, if I may cite Professor Pattanaik's argument, that ethically, if you want to take into account inequality, poverty, and so on, that's a description of the social state, and it shouldn't, how individuals feel about it in some sense shouldn't matter. So in Arrow's theorem is missing an ethical component which is being added. And where I find difficulty with the approach is when you try to make cardinal indexes from these things. The same problem, the ethical basis of those weights are clearly unclear. I would suggest Maurice's method of using fuzzy sets of fuzzy concepts, or to even use incomplete orderings, the partial orderings, as Professor Sen has said, rather than to cardinalize them with such brute force.
Okay. All right.
I don't know whether that answers your question.
Yes, of course. So we have to broaden our informational basis and
That's right.
include the ethical dimension in the process.
Ethical dimension from a sort of an outsider's point of view, not necessarily what those individuals in that society feels.
Okay, like Adam Smith's impartial spectators.
Whether an impartial spectator or some from behind some veil of ignorance, you can do Harsan, you can do Rawls.
Rawls's reflective equilibrium.
Yes.
Yes. Okay, now I understand. It's clear. Okay, so we are at the end of our session. So, uh, Professor Rajat Deb, thank you so much for your excellent presentation and thought-provoking words and sessions. So I would like to request if you would kindly share your presentation slides with our participants.
So I will
you
send
don't.
it to you, Ronnie Bhai.
Okay, sir. Okay,
Thank you.
Thank you. And Professor Pattanaik, sir, would you like to say some concluding words?
Well, the concluding words will be to say again how much I have enjoyed Rajat's lecture and what a vast range of things he covered in the course of 1 hour or so. It is absolutely impressive. I would like to express my appreciation.
Yes. And Professor Swati Narayan also thank Professor Rajat Deb for his excellent presentation.
Thank you.
Thank you, sir. And with that words, we would like to conclude our session session 7 for today. Thank you and take care. Bye.
Thank you.
Thank you.
Thank you.